Good morning. This is solving using square roots, and this is for Mrs. Wise's Algebra 2 class. So I wanted to do a video just so you'd have some help at home. I'm going to work through some problems that we may or may not have done in class. So I just did examples in class, and I'm going to do examples exactly how we did them there. So we started out our examples with m squared is equal to 1. And we talked a little bit about why we would want to use to solve this problem using the square root method instead of factoring it out. Now we could factor it out. When I talk about factoring it out, I mean m squared minus 1 is equal to 0, and it ends up being m minus 1 times m plus 1. And so then we set m minus 1 equal to 0 and m plus 1 is equal to 0. And then I solve m is equal to 1 and m is equal to negative 1. Well, there's an easier way to do this. Because we have a quantity that is squared on one side, and then in this case it's m squared, and then a constant on the other, we can solve this equation by just taking the square root of both sides. But we do have to remember that when we do that, the answer over here, the constant answer, is going to be plus or minus the square root of whatever constant is underneath the radical. So when I take the square root of m squared, it is m. And when I take the square root of 1, it's going to be 1. But remember, I have plus or minus 1. So my solution ends up being the same. Well, of course, it's going to get a little bit harder. So let's look at another problem, and that's 6x squared minus 2 is equal to 4. So I'm just going to try to isolate the squared quantity by itself, which in this case is x squared. So I'm going to add 2 to both sides of the equation, and then I'm going to divide by 6 because I'm undoing multiplying by 6. And when I do that, it becomes x squared is equal to 1. When I have the quantity squared on one side, a constant on the other, then I can just take the square root of both sides. Do not forget it's the positive and negative. And then x is equal to plus or minus 1 again. Now it does get a little bit more complicated. So let's look at a problem such as the following. X squared is equal to negative 42. Well, in this case, there's two things that are an issue. The first issue is that whenever I take the square root, it's going to be a negative under the radical. The second issue is 42 is not a perfect square. So I do have a number on one side and then a constant squared on the other, so I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And so that leaves me with x squared plus or minus. And then I'm going to break this down into things that I know I can take the square root of. So I know it's going to be negative 1 times 42. But let's do our factor tree that we worked on. Last week, and we can find out that the factors of 42 are 2, 3, and 7. That's the prime factorization. So looking at this, there are no pairs that I can pull out, so I'm going to multiply them back together, and it's going to equal negative 1 times 42. Well, I know when I take the square root of x squared, I know that I'm going to be left with 42 under the radical. But what is the square root of negative 1? And that square root of negative 1 is I. So this is my answer. X is equal to plus or minus the square root, plus or minus I times the square root of 42. Another problem that's similar to this one, I have 8k squared minus 7 is equal to 109. Again, I want to isolate my squared quantity. So I'm going to add 7 to both sides, and then I have 8k squared is equal to 116, and then I divide both sides by 8, and so I have k squared is equal to 8 goes into 116 one time 36. Oh my goodness, it's not going to be a problem that we can do very easily. So it's going to be 8 goes into there 4 times, 32 with 4 left over. So 4 out of 8 is going to be 15.0, so, or 5. 40, and that's 0. So underneath, or right here, it's going to be 14.5. Well, right off the bat, I know that I'm just going to end up taking, oh, you know what? So I'm going to just end up taking the square root of both sides. So it's going to be k is equal to positive or negative the square root of 14.5. And the problem with this one is I wrote it down incorrectly. So this time I'm going to do it and I'm going to write it down correctly. 8k squared minus 7 is equal to negative 109. So in this case, I kind of follow the same patterns. I'm going to add 7 to both sides, okay? And it's going to be 8k squared is equal to negative 102. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 8. And again, I think we're going to have k squared is equal to 8 goes into 102 one time, and then goes in there 28, 8 goes into 22 two times, and then it's going to be 6/8 left over, so, and 3/4. So 12 3/4. Well, again, I can't take the square root of a decimal number. It's not a perfect square, so I can't take the square root of it, but it's not a perfect square. So again, your answer is I, because I can take out the I, times the square root of 12.75. So that one's a little bit more difficult. Hopefully this will help you understand how to solve using square roots.